The ring is colder than old iron and hisses like a memory when Indiana Jones lifts it from the ash. His fingers smell of dust, leather, and smoke. The lantern threw a small circle of yellow upon the floor, and beyond that light, the watchtower dissolved into ribs of shadow and ruin. He had come for nothing more noble than a ledger and a scratched amulet he had expected mold and mice, the dry boredom of cataloging. Instead, his palm closed on a band so thin and dark that it drank the lantern's edge and left the air around it strangely thin, like winter in a greenhouse. When metal touched his skin, a whisper ran along the inside of his skull, names that tasted like kings and the feel of crowns on bones, and, for an instant, the tower's silence answered him with a cold, slow echo. He set the ring down on a scrap of cloth as a man might lay a live coal. The metal was not simply black, it seemed to have been burned of light, as if some hand had taken a sun and rubbed it raw. Tiny marks crawled along its face, not raised, but moving beneath his gaze, like script seen in water. He had dug up many things: coins with the faces of forgotten emperors, idols that smelled faintly of incense and rot. None had pulled at him like this. At the edges of perception, the ring murmured of dominion, of laws made and broken, of vows that bent like reeds, and the sound was sweet enough to make his teeth ache. Curiosity is a blade that cuts loyalties. Indiana had long known that archaeology breeds it by necessity. To see was to possess a truth no one else had, and possession made the world yield another inch of its shame. He told himself he would be a scholar first, to study, to weigh, to record. That was the method by which men kept their hands clean. He wrapped the ring in his handkerchief, slid it into the inner pocket of his jacket, and felt the metal drop against his ribs as if some small, deliberate heart had been pressed into his chest. He told himself the pocket was proof against accident. He told himself nothing of how the inside of his mouth was suddenly dry, as though a thirst had been opened there that no water would slake. The tower did not stay silent. A wind came up the stairwell cold as a blade and brought with it a smell like deep earth and old iron. A stone shifted somewhere above, a sound like a cautious beast moving in the dark. The lantern's flame flickered and then steadied. The trembling of it made shadows jump like men. He listened for footsteps from below, for the reckless tread of thieves or the measured approach of soldiers, but only the watch of the world answered him. A distant cry of a bird, the small drip of condensation from a cracked gutter, time keeping its slow counsel. Yet the hair at the back of his neck stood up, and he had to stop himself from rubbing it, because he felt the ring's attention as plainly as if it were a second heartbeat. Images came without warning, quick and tasting of iron, a ring on a finger and a face that could be ruler or ruin, a circle of men and candles, and a voice giving pledges to shadow. The vision was not a memory that belonged to him, but it had weight. It suggested ages folded together like old maps. He had read about such things, the talk of rings and rulership and yellowed marginalia, the way villages in certain valleys would cross themselves at mention of dark bargains. He had also read warnings in other volumes, ancient superstitions spun by learned hands that were sometimes only superstition, sometimes the echo of a truth too large to be comfortable. That scholarly doubt gnawed at him now. Could a thing so slight hold such hunger? He tried to approach with the tools that had never failed him: scale, ledger, patience. He set the lantern on the stone bench and pulled out his notebook. The pencil left a gray trail, neat and methodical. He sketched the band with a line that shook more than he liked. He wrote the runes as best he could, words that slipped from one form to another while his eyes crossed, like trying to pin a bird to a page. Each time his hand drew closer, the whisper rose a degree, as though the object were reading his breath. He made a list of options, the calm voice of training listing them. Secure the find, notify the museum, send samples to the university, but the list folded under the weight of an idea that was not on the page. Consult the wise. There are men, he thought, whose counsel sits outside the ledger. Which wise? The thought of names made his chest tighten. In the old myths, the wise did not always wear robes. Sometimes they came like storms, sometimes like gray travelers with staffs. One name rose in his mind with an easy certainty, Gandalf, carried not by nostalgia, but by the same practical logic that led a doctor to consult a surgeon. The wizard, he remembered, moved in the world like a man with keys. If keys existed that might lock a thing away, here was a locksmith. To travel to such a person from the watchtower would require time and judgment better than his own. In matters of such craft and danger, he could feel the ring's impatience like a heat under his ribs, an animal pressing for a seam to slip. He would not, he told himself fiercely, be the man who unmade the world for a scrap of glory. He packed with the deliberation of someone who had survived storms and gunfire. The ring went into a metal box he kept for fragile specimens, cushioned with scraps of wool and the oilcloth he used for maps. He wrapped the box in a map and strapped it to his pack, as if concealing contraband. The map hid its weight and made it seem like ordinary cargo. He knew the theater of secrecy. Closing a box made fearful things feel smaller. But he also knew the opposite, that secrecy can forge its own hunger, that hiding a thing gives it a place to speak from. He put the lamp out with a practiced pinching of his fingers and the small final hush of a man who had learned to move in darkness. Outside the tower, the world lay under a sky, a color of pewter, low and heavy with rain that had not yet fallen. The road descending from the hill fed into a landscape of hedgerows and broken fences where dogs barked once and then fell silent. Far off, a light moved like a watchful eye, then blinked out. He wrapped his jacket tight and felt the rings cold through the wool, a steady, uncanny insistence. The thought of wearing it, that swift, traitorous notion, arrived like a whisper and was gone. But it left its footprint, a quick imagining of power so tangible that for a few heartbeats he believed it possible to bend men with a gesture. He closed his fist around the strap of his pack and forced his breath into an even rhythm. He had friends he could trust for counsel, men and women of learning who would debate and test and teach the patience of a thing into safety. But this was not only a matter for laboratories and archives. The ring operated in other measures, of oaths and kingship, of borders and bindings. He needed a counsel that thought in those measures, a mind both long and lithe. Gandalf's name came to him again with a gravity that was not merely legend. If the ring had been found by any hand other than his, perhaps things would have already begun to move, the small gears in the world that wake when such objects are touched. It was better, he told himself, to be the man who moved first. He made no boasts. He would not carry the artifact carelessly or flaunt it before curious eyes. He would go to Gandalf with the ring in the small metal box and put it between them like an accusation. He would speak plain truths and hope plain reason would be enough. and yet he felt the old private kernel of his nature, an appetite for discovery sharp as a flint. The ring fed that appetite with a whisper, patient as a tide. He pledged to himself to guard, to consult, to learn, but even as he pledged, a corner of his explorer's soul leaned forward, wanting to see how far understanding could stretch before the world demanded payment. Before he left the tower, he paused at the threshold and looked back at the lantern's pool, at the place where the ring had lain upon the ash. The stones seemed to look back, older than he, bearing witness without judgment. He slid the box into his satchel, shouldered it, and locked the tower door with a small key that turned with a reluctant sound. The lane below would take him past farms and a crossing where a stream slit the land like a silver knife. He planned the route in a mind that had been schooled to detail. Hours of daylight, the need for a horse if the road held surprises. But there was another calculation he held unpenned. The ring's appetite was not patient. Each mile would be a test of will, each encounter a potential mirror for what lay in his pocket. He set his jaw, felt the metal against his ribs, and moved down into the rain-brushed world with a single, clear intent: to seek counsel before the object's hunger had time to wake fully. The gray figure did not. Stride he arrived as weather does, folding the light and turning the air colder. Gandalf's cloak was the color of old storms, his staff a dark spear that drank the gulls' cries. He stood over the blackened band and did not reach for it. He looked at Indiana Jones as one might look upon a man who has held a match to a dry forest and then wondered why the tinder smokes. "Do you feel it?" Gandalf asked, and his voice was neither hurried nor calm. It carried the weight of things kept secret until their time came to walk on the road. The ring gleamed, dull and small in the soil. It made the air taste of iron and seaweed, as if the world recalled the deep places where metal remembers fire. Indy could answer with profession. Artifacts must be cataloged, provenance, established context, preserved. He had spent a life unbuttoning the past and arranging it on clean trays. He could already see labels in display cases, glass warmed by gallery lights, tourists craning their necks with the same greedy gentleness that had made him pry into tombs and temples for 30 years. The ring weighed nothing, and yet it pulled at his palm like a confused animal. Gandalf did not smile. "That band is not to be studied as you study a coin," he said plainly. "It was wrought to bind wills. It speaks a language older than kings. It will not be argued with. Only the fire that shaped it can unmake it." Indy raised his chin. Habit gave him armor, a faculty of disbelief that had saved him from curses, cults, and con men. "Forged where?" he asked, wanting dates and signatures. His voice was dry. He wanted details because details could be traded in like favors or bullets. "Mount Doom," Gandalf answered. The name fell, and there was a hush in the room that no candle could hold. Orad Ruin. In the heart of Mordor, the syllables reshaped the air. Indy had read maps drawn by men who thought themselves very clever. Names on a page were one thing. A place that answered to a single word was another. He pictured black rock like a wound, smoke like breath, a land without bird song. He felt his bones register that such a place existed and that it had a hunger. "You asked me to take this where?" Indy said. The question was half incredulity, half a bargaining jab. He could not yet hear the deeper moral chord in Gandalf's tone, only the immediate absurdity. He had crossed deserts by train, tangled with Nazis and cultists, outrun death with a grin. He had not signed up for cosmic furnaces. Gandalf's eyes, pale and fierce, steadied him. "It must be unmade there," he said. "It cannot be used. It cannot be hidden with any safety. If it endures, so will he who seeks it. If it goes unchecked, it will sing again to those whose hearts answer to song. It will gather kings and thieves and empires to its tune." Indy's fingers tightened on the ring. For a heartbeat he saw, clear and terrible, a world polished smooth by that song. Maps redrawn, men reduced to pawns, museums become vaults for crowns and terror. He saw faces he loved in the edge of that vision, students, old colleagues, and they were small as coins clicking into place. The ring did what it promised. It did not bargain. Gandalf spoke then as one who has chosen the blunt instrument rather than the honeyed lie. "Neither I nor any who walk in my stead can bear it. Its way is not the way of wielders. The road to its unmaking is one that must consume what it touches. I will not ask you to carry this if you are not willing to be its last burden." Indy had spent a life saying yes to danger and no to tyranny, but the choice Gandalf offered was of a different order. To take the ring was not a stunt or an archaeological confidence trick. It was to accept a fate that could close him off from the small certainties he had built, the smell of old books, the laugh of a friend, the taste of whiskey in the rain. He felt suddenly and sharply the thinness of the line between his professional bravado and a moral abyss. "What do you want of me?" he asked. The words were steadier now. He knew how to bargain. He had bought lives in the nick of time with clever hands. Yet there was no price that mattered here. He could not make a deal that would leave the ring intact. Gandalf looked at the band, then back to Indy. "I would have you take it where it cannot sing. I would have you walk the road that leads to the only fire which can drown its voice. You do not go as conqueror, you go as bearer. You go alone in the choice, though you shall not be alone in the road, alone in the choice." The phrase landed like a stone in a pool. Indy felt every ripple. He thought of companions he might recruit, soldiers, scholars, men who might be bought or inspired, and knew the lie in that imagination. The ring did not recruit, it colonized. To bring others was to invite their ruin. Gandalf's words did not forbid friends, but they forbade the illusion of safety in numbers. "You want me to walk into Mordor," Indy said, the name like a physical bruise. "To Orodruin." "Yes," Gandalf replied, "and you will have allies if they are true. You will have tests and betrayals and the great pull of what you have found, and you will find that what you intend does not always follow your plan. The road is crooked, and its ends are older than maps." Indy let out a breath he did not know he had been holding. He had been an actor in many histories, but this was not an excavation he could frame. There were no ledgers for choices that rewrote the world. Still, the man beneath the fedora was simple enough. When faced with a wrong one could not let stand, he acted. He had once stolen a golden idol from a temple because he believed it would kill many. He had once pulled a child from a burning church because he heard the child's cry. This, he understood, was one of those moments. "What if I keep it hidden?" he asked, the old lawyer in him surfacing. "Drop it in a vault, throw it in the sea, hide it in a tomb with a watchman. There are always precautions." Gandalf's look was not unkind. "You would hide a sickness under carpets and bury a beast in a garden," he said. "You would trust the vigilance of men who grow old and die. The ring outlasts men. You would make a prison whose key no one can afford to turn. Then, one spring morning, some hand will find it and the song will begin again. Better a single burning than countless slow deaths. Better one journey into doom than 1,000 years of quiet corruption. The words were a hammer on an anvil. Indy felt the anvil give. He saw the sequences, as any man of action does. Take the ring, keep it secure, travel to the fire, cast it in. But the sequence was not merely technical. It required a submission of self. It required that he place a thing impossible to measure, the integrity of his will, on the scales and trust it would not tip. He thought of his father, of ghosts of ruins that taught him how to listen to stone. He thought of the many times he had chosen the immediate good over a safer calculation. He imagined a museum wing where the ring sat under glass, attractive and reviled. He imagined scholars writing papers while the world outside bent toward a darker music. "I keep it long enough to get there," Indy said finally. The words were not triumphant. They were a contract signed in the dark. He knew he might be wrong. He knew he might fail. But he had never been a coward in front of the line of duty. Gandalf inclined his head, and for a moment the old wizard's face showed relief, as if a long argument had been settled. "You will be tested," he said. "The ring will speak to what you want most. It will promise the restoration of loss and the triumph over those who have wronged you. It will paint the past perfect and the future as justice. Hold to the small light within you. Name what is not to be bartered." Indy touched the hat at his hip, the crease down its center like a seam in his posture. There was no small light. Usually he made do with a cynical humor and the muscle memory of action. Yet beneath that weathered shell, a stubborn kernel remained, an insistence that some things were not for sale. "Then show me the road," he said. Gandalf moved as if to gather himself, and then his fingers closed around the ring in a manner that would have struck lesser men as rash. He did not put it on. He did not pretend to test the weight on his finger. Instead, he wrapped the band in a scrap of cloth and handed it to Indy. The cloth smelled of smoke and rain. It was small and utterly ordinary. "Take it in a belt," Gandalf advised. "Do not slip it on your finger. Do not speak of it to those who would keep you company for reasons you cannot trust. Seek counsel where counsel is wise. There are those who will know how to help, and those who will use you for the ring." Indy looped the cloth into his belt, the band a cool press against his hip. He had worn sacred coins and cursed amulets in his time. This was different. It carried a presence that bent him inward. He felt the compulsion to conceal, to deny, to prove to himself he could be master of the temptation by sheer cunning. Outside, unseen in the dusk, a sound reached them, a faint, whining wind that was like a cry made by something airborne and hungry. Gandalf's head turned, alert. "They stir," he said. "The shadow grows longer than before." Indy felt a prickle on the back of his neck. He had smelled weather before, thunder in the distance, ozone before lightning, but this smell was older. It was the taste of steel and iron, and it carried with it the memory of many feet marched in uniform, the echo of drums. The world felt thinner, as if some great curtain had been drawn in a neighboring room, and they both stood too close to it. "What now?" Indy asked. He had accepted the first demand and thought the problem solved into motion. Yet every acceptance in this tale seemed to open another door. Gandalf fixed the horizon with eyes that had seen more roads than most men had ever crossed. "Now we move," he said. "There are those who must be told and those who must not. There are horses to borrow, ships to avoid, mountains that will decide whether you pass. The first step is to Rivendell for counsel. You will not go on alone. There are bonds that must be made and enemies who already sent the rings passing. Rivendell. The name arrived like a promise of respite, cool water, lamplight, and wise faces preserved from a world unshorn of memory. It was a thin comfort, but a comfort all the same. Indy pictured glades and music, and he held the image as a talisman against the pressure at his hip. He rose. The room seemed to narrow. The lamp's flame looked small and sudden, as if it did not know the scale of what had been chosen. Gandalf's staff tapped the floor, and the sound was a punctuation. "Prepare yourself," Gandalf said. "You will need more than courage, Dr. Jones. You will need an openness of heart and the humility to be shaped by what you cannot command." Indy felt a laugh that was half terror and half old habit behind his teeth. It tasted sour. He had been humbled before by time, by loss, by a rope that had given way at a cliff's edge. But this was beyond the ledger of scars. Still, he moved to gather his gear with a steadier hand than he felt. The band in his belt was a cold weight, a constant companion, and a secret he could not share with any ledger. Outside, the dusk had deepened. Somewhere to the east, a thin glow like the rebound from a forge creased the cloud line. Gandalf's cloak drew about him, and the two of them stepped from the shelter of the room into a night that felt different from any Indy had known. The lamplight fell behind them. Ahead lay riverbeds and roads. Further yet was the shape of a mountain and a furnace that would decide whether the world remained as it was or became what the ring promised. They walked toward the lane that would lead them first to council, then to embassies, and then, if the world did not tilt away entirely, toward the fire that had cast the thing that now slept against Indy's skin. Each step sounded like a tolling bell. He did not know if he would keep his vow when temptation struck, but he had chosen the road by moving his feet. As the town receded, the night bore witness to a new sound, distant and like the beating of wings. It was not yet terror. It was a portent. Indy tightened his hand on the scrap of cloth at his belt, feeling the small black ring beneath, and drew a breath that tasted of rain and iron. He had accepted the ultimatum. He had bound his fate, however reluctantly, to a journey whose end might bury him or redeem the world. They walked into the dark, and the road waited. The moment the thing slipped against his skin, the world altered as if the air itself had folded. Clay and dust and the smell of sweating men fell away. Sound narrowed to the small bright ring of a bell inside his skull, and with it came a vision so whole that it felt like memory rather than promise. He saw himself standing on a stony terrace, a crown heavy upon his brow. Beneath him, leagues of broken banners lay as ragged as old maps. Men and kings knelt, their faces washed out by a light that was not sunlight. It was not the glitter of treasure he saw, but the slow, patient ruin of law and city, the making and unmaking of authority within his grasp. The temptation arrived not as thunder, but as a hand offering a chalice, cold, inevitable, and strangely domestic. He drew breath and found the air tasted of iron. Around him, his colleagues shifted, boots against gravel. A lamp jarred so that a smear of yellow moved like a living thing on the rock. They did not yet know the particulars of the compulsion that had wound through him. They only saw his eyes, briefly gone glassy, and the small furtive motion of his hand closing over the band. One of them, his voice thin with the night, urged retreat. "Indy, take it off," he said. "We can't carry that here." Indy did not answer. The Nazgul were not yet visible, but their presence was a pressure at the edge of hearing, like geese arriving before a storm. The breeze carried no leaves, only a sound like cloth dragged over stone. Then a shriek lanced the dark, a high, terrible note that made hair rise along a man's forearm. It came from far and nearer at once, and in the trembling light a shape unfolded upon the ridge, a rider of shadow atop a pale toothed horse, neither fully horse nor fully some other thing, a reek of cold and iron about it. Behind came more, black foils against the sky. They were drawn as sure as iron to fire. The Nazgul smelled the ring as wolves smell a frightened lamb. A single use had set a beacon in the world, and the beacon burned slope to slope. Indy felt the heat of that mark even under the ring's cool thumb, the sensation of being seen through a skin he had thought private. It was not mere detection. It was an attention that made calculus of him, weighing his will against the old hunger that had birthed the one. He had slipped the ring on in a moment of terror. Now that same act unfurled consequences as inexorable as tide. One of his companions, older, steady as a pillar of stone, moved to him as if to pull the band from his finger. "Don't," Indy rasped, and the word was less a plea than a command to his own pulse. He could feel politeness erode inside him, replaced by a new grammar, sovereign, not scholar. Images rushed in, crowns, scepters, the heavy velvet of courthouses, the murmurs of 1,000 men who would obey if he only asked. Power did not come like a blade, it came like a map, and he loved maps. The Nazgul drew nearer. Their horses made no full sound, but the night itself shuddered with a dry rasp, as if winter had come early and scraped the world with a knife. The lead rider raised something not a hand so much as a pointer of black air, and the direction it touched made the whole troop hone in like compasses. Even as the cold spread, there was an odd clarity in being marked. Decisions sharpened, the expedition's options, which had been many and messy, reduced to two stark things: concealment or the wearing of the ring as a signal, conspicuous power. Concealment meant walking like thieves beneath a sunless canopy, burying the band in leather or bone, or swallowing the artifact whole into the secret of his pack. It meant lying, avoidance, silence, slipping past watchers, ducking from light, a course of patience and small deceptions. Conspicuous power meant something else. It meant wielding the ring openly when the time demanded, wearing its promise as armor and weapon. It meant admitting the beacon and learning to use its call to shape men and tide, to command rather than flee. There was fear in that choice, but there was also a scholar's thrill. He could name stones. He could read patterns where others saw only ruin. To him, power had always been a means to uncover secrets. The ring offered a way not to hide knowledge, but to impose it. That logic glittered for an instant, clean and rational, before the old moralities cracked and bled into the shadows. A horse's breath steamed like sickly smoke. One of the riders dismounted oddly, as if his legs were not quite his own to move, and the thing that moved among the shadows was less a man than a fragmentation of commands, voices that had worn too many crowns. The Nazgul's approach was not merely a hunt, it was a summons. They came because something in the world had called them. The ring had answered. "Indy," whispered a woman at his shoulder, and her voice carried a razor edge he had not heard from her before. She was a scholar in her own right, and there was dust in the line of her brow that spoke of the road. You can't fight those things. You can't bargain with them. She kept her hand near the hilt of a knife, not to strike but to tear if needed. Her fear was honest. It did not dramatize. It made him more than a little ashamed, for the ring stripped shame like bark from a tree. The vision rose again, larger and brighter. A throne of black iron, people kneeling in streets that were not streets, but stages, every confession rehearsed. There was also ruin there, cities made hollow, libraries burned to textless cinders, songs unsung. Power was a sculptor. As much as it was a weapon, it made the world in its image, and that image pleased him. He felt the taste of victory on his tongue, and for a moment he permitted himself to imagine a different end for the expedition. No longer fugitives or curators, they might be rulers, undertakers of a new order that safeguarded relics through authority rather than reverence. He saw himself turning from scholar to steward of a continent. The Nazgul moved faster. Shadows braided themselves over the nearer hillocks until their riders were a serrated skyline. A wind picked up and threw sparks of dust that looked like dying embers. Around them, the living folk, the party pressed closer, voices hushed, eyes wide. Someone muttered an old litany, words of concealment and old superstitions, and their sound was like pebbles skittering down a slope. Fear makes a sound of its own, and it propelled them to act. He could have slipped the ring off then. He could have cast it into a hidden crevice or handed it over to be guarded until they reached some safer keep. That was the scholar's solution. Relinquish the object. Catalog it from a distance. Let others decide its fate. But the ring had changed the terms of that prudence. Once worn, its signature did not vanish with its removal. A bell once rung still sounded in valleys. Sauron's gaze had felt him. Sauron's watch would not stop because the ring was stowed. A plan coalesced, quick as the folding of a page. If they walked into the open and used the ring's new visibility as a maneuver, they might transform a hunt into a march. He thought of stages. Begin by wearing the ring to silence the immediate hunt, then use its power to steer the Nazgul toward a place of his choosing, a place where he could bargain, bluster, or betray. He had faced worse odds in tombs and jungles where traps and curses braided the air. There was a comfort in the old rhythms of threat and counter-threat. Here, the danger was not stones or snakes, but a slow, ubiquitous will. He told himself he could learn that language. "You're talking about tempting fate," someone said, voice small but unyielding, that someone had hands that had cataloged scrolls and turned brittle leaves into history. The accusation carried with it the weight of conscience. The camp listened, the air taut as a bowstring. Indy put his palm over the ring where it rested warm as a mouth. The metal hummed against his skin in a way that made him think of an insect trapped in glass. The hum did not sing, it instructed. It showed him a way forward like a lit path through a black wood. He imagined the ring making them invisible, making him unseen, then imagined using it to speak and have whole armies bend their knees. He imagined himself walking into courts where decisions were made and declaring terms. The Nazgul were nearer still. A shape detached itself from the others, a closer shadow, more solid. It paused on the slope like a thing smelling the future. The call it sent pulsed through the hillside. Men who had no stakes in kingship felt their muscles tighten. The camp's laughter, such as it had been, dried. Someone clutched a pack tighter. Another cradled a map as if it were a living thing. Indy saw then the immediate utility of stubborn grandeur. If the ring could be used to shield the weak, to strike a bargain that saved lives, then perhaps wielding it was not only a surrender, but a service. He thought of the dusty children he had once pulled free from danger, of ruins left to rot because no one had had the audacity to claim them. Power as a tool, an ungainly, dangerous tool, might be better than concealment that left trails and unhealed wounds. In the ring's whisper, moral compromise became strategy. Strategy in turn became an argument. A presence loomed closer, close enough now that the cold had a taste of metal. The Nazgul's breath made the torches flare and gutter, and the horses, withered things that smelled of old graves, snorted like censers. A voice came then, low and sibilant, not in words but in exigency. The air around the rider carved into attention. The decision, such as it was, could not wait. He made one small sound, not a shout, but a syllable like a coin dropped into a quiet well. It was the signal to move. The party gathered, hands finding straps, lamps dimmed, the small rituals of motion performed out of muscle memory. The ring burned faintly at his finger as if reminding him of its existence with a private, hot endorsement. Indy weighed the choice one last time. Concealment promised stealth and secrecy, a dim road where one might yet survive unmarked. Conspicuous power promised dominion and the means to bend a hunt to a purpose. Both paths carried ruin as their shadow. He felt the world narrow to a seam beneath his boot, and with a scholar's steady certainty, he stepped toward the seam and chose. He slipped the ring further down his finger so that its band cupped the skin, and then he turned his face to the ridge where the Nazgul waited. The night was a mouth that opened, and the wind carried the sound of distant horns. His companions could see him. They could see the small, terrible decision lived upon his hand. He did not tell them why he would not remove it. He did not need to. As they moved, the landscape seemed to tilt toward Mordor, as if an invisible current were pulling them. The ring thrummed, and a thought, wide and sudden, filled his head: to lead, to make, to claim. In that thought lay a promise and a debt. He answered it by stepping forward, not toward safety, but into the place where the watchers already waited. The hunted became a march, and the march wore a ring that had tasted the world and decided to speak. The ash lay like old paper across his boots, whispering with every step, as if eager to record the name he had come to hold. The air tasted of iron and sulfur and something older, a faint tang that clung to the back of his throat and to the memory of other hands that had touched great things and paid for them. He kept the ring wrapped in a scrap of canvas beneath his shirt, against the steady drum of his ribs, feeling its small heat, like a secret ember, and every time he drew breath, he imagined the pulse of it learning him, learning how to make a man bend. He told himself, at first, what he had always told museums: provenance matters. The ring had belonged to a line of kings, to a smith whose name had been lost in smoke. The record was fragmentary, but enough remained to make it inevitable that such things demanded study. For weeks he had spoken as if the lectures still clung to him, about catalogs, comparanda, the ethics of possession. Those words had kept him humane. They had been the harness that told him where curiosity ended and stewardship began. Stewardship turned in his hands to calculation. The catalog entries multiplied in his mind as if on a ledger: date of deposition, signs of use, alloy traces, the slight darkening under the bezel. Each fact suggested a route, a leverage point, a bargaining chip. If he could prove an earlier owner had once hidden the ring to protect the greater folk, perhaps he could claim a moral right. If he could find a fragment of inscription hidden in the folds of the dark metal, perhaps he could argue that knowledge demanded immediate containment. His voice grew quieter when he argued these things aloud, almost conspiratorial, and he began to enjoy the hush. He began to define exceptions. He wrote them in the air between sentences. Desperate times, greater good, necessary deceits. When Mira questioned him, as she always had when curiosity became risk, her voice carried the worn patience of someone who had followed him not for the adventure, but for the man she knew. He learned how to answer her without confessing the small theft that had first turned his hands. He spoke of duty. He spoke of the need to reach the mountain before others did. Mira believed him more readily than he expected. That belief became the instrument he tuned. They had shared water that morning and a thin stew that lacked meat but still warmed the chest. She tied his boot. When a torn lace came undone, fingers calloused in ways that spoke of long travels. He felt the motion as sharp as a blade, a human kindness wielded by hands that might save a ruined life. He thought of catalogs then of how hands were recorded, how fingerprints, how wear marked the smallest things with story. He pressed the memory into a different shape and used it like a map. On the ridge where the weather broke and ash fell faster, he chose a side path. It was a narrow cleft, half hidden under a lip of black stone that cut an hour from the long march toward the mountain. He had seen it on a map earlier, a fissure that would let one avoid the orc watchers along the main road. He had called it to Mira's attention, and she had smiled with that weary relief of a companion who had found a shortcut. He felt a sharp, unfamiliar satisfaction at the thought of that smile. He knew, because of the way artifacts bent men, that the ring wanted speed. The quicker the journey, the sooner the action, the sooner the ring could be surrendered or preserved or used. He told himself it did not matter which word he chose, for each would justify him. He hooked his fingers into the strap of Mira's pack under the guise of steadying her on the slick rock and loosened it just enough that the fastenings would fail when the path became treacherous. A small sabotage, a small lie. When she stumbled, he rushed forward with the instinct of the man who had spent a lifetime pulling others free of traps and collapsing roofs. He caught her arm, his knuckles white, the canvas of the ring pressing hot against his chest. She laughed once, breathless, trusting. He let his grip slip an inch, then two, owning nothing when her foot sought a step that would not hold. The pack slid, the strap caught on a jagged stone and gave with a sound like cloth being cut. Mira cursed softly and then steadied herself without falling. She looked at him with an expression that was not blame, but calculation, the way a comrade reads the battlefield and chooses next moves. He told himself the delay would not be long. The main road at that hour would be watched more closely. A traveler stopped to set a broken lace right then might be questioned, detained, searched. He imagined the questions and the fear and how easily the ring's presence could be revealed. He imagined, too, how a night's delay might let a Nazgul scent them, how a minute might unmake everything. He thought of catalogs again, a missing entry, a theft, the world unmade by rumor. He allowed his hands to be practical. He unspooled a coil of rope and looped it below a ledge where the wind might take it. A shortcut, he explained, his voice without shame. Mira tightened the pack herself this time, fingers going over the stitches with a contemplative hush. She did not laugh. She did not ask what had been in his mind when his fingers had slipped. Perhaps she had guessed. Perhaps she had placed the possibility of betrayal in the same pocket where she had kept her fear. She returned his look with a patience edged with sorrow. That night, around a small fire, he listened to the rings. Silence. It spoke differently now. Not the soft insinuation of possession, but the clearer commands of a thing that sensed its path. He could feel the map of it in himself, as if the ring had set a compass in his heart, and that compass pointed unerringly toward the mountain. He ran his thumb along the dark band beneath his shirt and tasted ash at the back of his mouth. The catalog hound in him found excuses to delay formal entries. No proper light, no safe surface, the urgency of travel. Excuses smoothed into rule. The next morning, the watchers were nearer than he had estimated. He saw them as shapes under the lip of a ridge, armored and leering with a hunger that was not merely for coin. Moraine and shadow worked in their favor. He turned his face away from their eyes, feeling the ring tremble like a beetle in a hollow. The path he had chosen would bring him within their sight if he persisted. He had options, a feint, a longer detour, a parley. He thought of parley as he had once thought of interviews and barters. A game of words where a good record might win leniency. Mira spoke softly, suggesting the detour that would add hours but might spare them confrontation. He watched the gray of their armor, the gleam of weapons. He heard her voice and felt the sweep of her hand in the air, the way she always found the humane solution. He remembered catalogs again, how they taught restraint, the margin of care to be left undisturbed. He moved his lips and told her the humane thing to do, because the humane thing was not his choice that day. He watched her obey. As they rounded the farther bend, a shout rose like a breaking twig. Men, or something like men, came down upon them, not with the slow, methodical approach of negotiation, but with the quick efficiency of predators who had readied traps for years. In the first instant, the world narrowed to the ring, and the mountain all else blurred. He saw the look in Mira's face then, a flash of betrayal or perhaps of recognition that he had made a choice that she could not reconcile with her map of him. She reached for his sleeve, and he did not let her fingers find him. The skirmish was swift and animal. He fought by training, a shoulder, a hip, a save blow that landed in a tumble of ash. He felt the ring warm against his sternum like a hearth, a small insistence. At the end of the push, when boots were heavier and breaths came ragged, he saw the leader step forward, not entirely human, a scarred face with a husk of former gentleness. The leader held up a hand, and the moment lengthened. Bargains flickered in that held air. The leader read his face and saw what lay under the cloth. He smiled thinly. "Give what you carry," the leader said, and the words were not an offer. Mira looked at him. Her eyes were sea-slow and full of accusation. "We swore we'd not hide things," she said, the voice of someone who had loved him for the whole truth. He felt the old lectures like a warm cloak around his shoulders, a memory that could have sheltered him. He thought of the mountain, of the inscription perhaps, waiting in the dark metal, of the need to finish for the greater good. He thought of the ledger in his head, the way entries could be falsified for a perceived greater balance. He believed, with a cold certainty, that withholding the ring would save more lives than honesty ever could. He nodded once, The motion was small. He found the scrap of canvas beneath his shirt and palmed the ring out into his open hand. The ring felt heavier than the cloth had suggested, as if it had borrowed mass from the air itself. The leader reached forward with a roughness that smelled of greed and old fear. Then, in a motion that surprised him with its decisiveness, Indiana Jones pulled his hand back and let the ring slip into the folds of Mira's pack instead. He had engineered its hiding yet again, but not for safekeeping. He had placed it in her burden as though to conceal, knowing she would carry it willingly, trusting him. The leader's gaze turned in confusion and suspicion toward Mira. "She hides what you seek," he said quickly, voice measured. "Search her pack." It was a simple betrayal. He did not raise a sword. He did not raise his voice. He offered the necessary words, the right hints, and the leader moved, hands probed, fingers checked seams. The ring lay warm in its pocket, inert as a sleeping thing. When it was found, the leader's joy was quick and ugly. He took the ring, turning it as one would a coin of fortune, and the air shifted like wind over a tide. Mira's face changed as if a window had closed upon her. Later, but not long, when the leader spoke again and offered a bargain, Indiana felt the pleas of his old life recede entirely. He had not anticipated that the moment of betrayal would be so small and so immediate that it would not stain him in broad strokes, but in fine, repeated lines. He had not anticipated how ease would follow the first compromise, how thought could be trained to find ever new justifications. He watched as Mira's eyes narrowed, not in rage, but in a mournful recognition that things had been altered beyond repair. They left, with the leader in possession of the ring's outward gleam, but not yet of its deeper claim. The path to the mountain lay open now, because he had traded what was once the kernel of trust for passage. The exchange lodged in him like a stone in a shoe, each step ground harder because of it. He told himself the old men in classrooms would approve of his decisiveness, of the pragmatic calculus that had saved lives. In truth, he felt the hollow widen. That night, he tried to catalog the moment as if it were an artifact. He wrote nothing, but he arranged his memory as one arranges specimens. The light, Mira's hands, the leader's grin, the ring slipping into the pocket. Each detail sat under glass. He understood now how the ethics of possession, once a soft thing that bound him to others, could calcify into tactics. He understood that knowledge could become armor and then a blade. In the small hours, he rose and walked alone, the ash making his footsteps quiet. He pressed the doorstep of the mountain in his mind and felt the ring like a lodestone beneath his ribs. He had traded a truth for a road. He had betrayed a companion for speed. The man who had prized honesty and the preservation of story felt very distant, as if he had watched himself from a mirror whose silver had been scratched away. Ahead, beyond the veil of smoke, the air itself seemed to shift toward a demand. The path required not more cunning, but a different kind of sacrifice. He had given less than he would ultimately be asked to give. He rubbed his hands until they ached and felt the ring grow warm under the cloth at his chest. He knew, in the low place where oath meets bone, that there would be no clean return. The ledger of his life had been rewritten with a single entry. He clenched his jaw against the ache and stepped forward toward the mountain, carrying with him the quiet knowledge that the next compromise would be deeper, and that to reach the fire he would have to measure and perhaps cut. What of himself remained? Flame stole across his knuckles like living coin, hot and greedy and impossibly small. The air on the smoking rim lay heavy with the taste of iron and old smoke. His breath turned to grit beneath the brim of his hat. Below, the black throat of the crater breathed and sighed, and from that long, bottomless hunger came scents that no man should know: rotten sweetness, the salt tang of tears, the metallic grief of empires melted down to nothing. In his hand, the band was cold and bright as any trinket he had loved. But it was no trinket now. It was a mouth that watched him. It whispered the names of things men had built and broken, and it furnished him with whole kingdoms for the asking. Images flowed through his mind as if some unseen projector swept film across his thoughts. Faces unrolled there. Faces he had learned to look away from when bargain or bluff had better served him than honesty. There were the wide-eyed apprentices who had believed his promises, a collector whose smile had been measured in coins rather than gratitude, a woman once steady and fierce who had learned to put her trust in archaeology more than in him. Each countenance held, for an instant, the clear, puzzled hurt of being used. Each face carried a ledger where the tally was not coin, but betrayal. The ring stooped to show him these accounts, rubbing salt in them until the wounds gleamed. It showed brighter things as well. It offered the reconstruction of what he'd always been tempted to remake: ruined altars set right, vanished cities raised again like breath into stone, the names of forgotten peoples etched clean upon the tongue. It promised power, to set wrong things straight, to bend past shame into present glory. It made him imagine himself as the man who could rewrite history and thus redeem himself. No longer the one who took relics to display in glass cases, but the architect who could restore them to original splendor. The vision smelled of incense and new cut wood and the cool, decisive dust of libraries freshly reshelved. That promise came with a chorus. The ring's pleading was a litany of want, of dominion framed as benevolence, insistent as a merchant calling wares. It was older than any plea he'd heard in bazaars, and more cunning than his most famous cons. It reached into him like a hand that had known his taste for artifacts and knew where to pinch. It promised the face of his love returned, or rather, the image of the life he had always skimmed at the edges of. The bed for a weary head, a name remembered rightly, the applause reserved for those who set things right and wore the credit. Such visions were a mirror, too flattering in their angles. And then, beneath those seductions, there came another sound. It was thin and close, like breath through a reed, a chorus of the very men he had taken from. Their voices were small against the ring's roar, but steady. They were not the mighty visions of empires. They were the hum of everyday hurt. A child's toy lost to a collector's cabinet, a scroll that would never be read by the hand that had once penned it, a widow's shrine dismantled to feed a curiosity. These were not offers, but reckonings. They were not the wide maps the ring drew for his greed, but the ledger the world held against the taking of things that had meaning beyond price. Guilt is a cunning smith. It takes what you once prized and makes you see its cost, grinding the image of possession down until nothing gleams but the jagged edge of what was torn away. The ring pressed forward with visions of grandeur, the chorus of the wrong pressed back with small, patient grief. Indiana felt himself unfold between these weights as he had often unfolded maps on dusty tables. Careful, deliberate, on the point of discovery. He tasted blood on his tongue, or thought he did, and blamed the heat and the heat was honest. Sweat stung his eyes. The metal sat cool in his palm, impossibly heavy, as if it were not the thing itself, but all the futures it could purchase laid folded upon one another. He felt older than his years. He felt the softening in the bones of a man who had seen too much promised treasure and too often returned its shell. The rings will tightened. The world around him narrowed to the band and the fire and the little human figure gripping both, and the ring's seductive voice braided reason into fog until only one clear thing remained, the moment to choose. He had known other such moments in his life, of course. A trapeze swing when rope thinned and the air held only two hands, and a promise, a leap across a chasm where the other side bore either safety or a new betrayal. Each had demanded the surrender of one small prized possession, a plan, an illusion, a certainty. But none had asked for so much. His fingers closed. They trembled. There was a memory in the grip, a photograph of himself younger, the ghost of the man who loved artifacts purely for the story they told, whose hunger was less for ownership than for the tale that made a potsherd become history. That man loved discovery as if it were an act of worship. Here, at the rim of the world, the ring wanted to convert that worship into dominion. If he kept it, he would become a different kind of collector, a ruler of the narratives, a shaper of people's fates. If he cast it in, he would kill the chance to possess the story. He would surrender the temptation to press his thumb into fresh clay and call it his. His thumb found the seam, and the metal sat slick under it. The ring pulled and pushed with a warmth like breath and a cold like the inside of tombs. It offered him banners of praise and the silence of temples restored. It offered him all the faces he had wronged, turned to gratitude. He pictured the woman who had once trusted him. He pictured a laugh that had been cut short. In his chest, a quiet thing unanchored itself and drifted toward the light he had never thought he would name. Pity. The decision, when it came, was not the shout of a hero nor the quiet calculation of a scholar. It was a small, savage thing made of all the cheap compromises he had bartered away over a lifetime. It was the simple answer of a man who had seen what power does to things it loves. He drew his arm back as one shakes free of a clutching hand. With the force of every broken promise he had made and every apology he had never given, he hurled the band toward the fire. The ring went like a coin flung into a wishing well, spinning bright, unrepentant. It screamed in the small, brittle way of a thing that cannot bear to be denied. For an instant its plea filled the crater. For an instant the mountain took it, and the very air seemed to knit. Then there was a sudden, terrible untying. The scream was swallowed. A light, like a crossing of blades, burst and then collapsed in on itself. The eye that had watched from afar and the will that had used the ring's voice as its mouth thinned like a fog at dawn. The shadow that had knotted and bound the world loosened. The mountain shook. It was not the shudder of fear, but of release. Stone and smoke seemed to exhale together, and a wind lifted that tasted astonishingly of rain. Around him, the ash and the smoke thinned as if buffeted by a great unseen broom. The hatred in the air unspooled and faded. The chorus of pleading that had haunted his ears until now grew thin and then, at last, silenced. In its place came a gentler sound, the low, astonished murmur of things unbent. He staggered back as though a weight had been lifted from his shoulders. The ring's pull, once a constant ache in the marrow, was gone. So too was something else. He felt, with a sharp, private ache, as if a small chamber of his heart had been wrenched open and a piece of him carried away. There was no blood nor fracture, but an absence where certain hungers had lived. The man who had loved the look of weathered gold and the cool honesty of a museum label found himself standing on the rim of the world with a pocket less full of coin and a heart dimmer in its shine. He did not weep. He did not laugh. He simply stood, hat in hand, the hat of a man who had worn many disguises and seen many worlds. In that moment of quiet, the mountain's roar dwindled to a whisper, and the road back to the world lay clear and uncertain as a map with no inked cities. He could go back to the life he had known, the lectures, the old maps with new pinpricks, the thrill of lifting a lid and peering into the past. Or he could take this new raw sense of cost and let it craft a different life. To whom and by what measure did artifacts belong? To the rooms with careful lights and glass, or to the stories of the living who had shaped and been shaped by them? He gathered himself and began to descend. Each footfall on the blackened path was a small, deliberate sound. The acrid smell of sulfur gave way to cleaner air as he moved from the rim. His hands were steadier than he had expected. The man who had come seeking a thing to possess walked back carrying instead the knowledge of what possession demanded. He had not become saint nor sage. He carried, rather, a tired humility and a new regard for the mouths that had once cried out when treasures were taken. When at last he left the mountain behind, its smoke thinning into memory, he felt the world full of the ordinary small things that give it shape. A child's laughter in a market, the weight of a scroll freshly tied, the rough shoulder of a fellow traveler. He saw them now with an attention that had not been there before, as if brightness had returned to a palate he had long let dull. He thought of the shelves in museums and the storerooms of kings, and the huts where a potter's granddaughter might weep over a missing cup. He thought of restitution and of repair, and the work that would take. His footsteps carried him not toward a place he had known with any certainty, but toward the long road that leads west, the road that, in those lands, traveled toward home and toward choices. He kept his hat low and his jaw set. There was no swagger left in his gait. In the small private theater of his mind, there already began to form a plan of sorts, a route to places where things had been taken, names of those to ask, promises to make. None were yet written down. They were simply intentions, like arrows taut on bowstrings. He paused at a crossroads where a weathered sign pointed in two directions, one toward the cities that prized objects behind glass, the other toward villages where things were memory more than museum. He did not choose at once. The sun sat low and generous, gilding the road and the dust at his feet. He placed the hat back upon his head, feeling the felt settle in a way that felt new to him, and he shouldered his pack. He stepped forward toward the westward way, toward homes and reparations and small acts of return that might, in time, stitch the world closer. He had cast a thing into fire. He had broken its will. In so doing, he had broken a part of himself that had delighted without care. Now, with the ring gone and the mountain's verdict ringing soft and clear behind him, he walked into the bright twilight, intending to learn how to mend what he had once taken, and how, perhaps, to teach others that courage may mean not claiming treasure, but letting it stay where it belongs,